Welcome to the journey of prophetic redemption. My name is Paul Hedworth. To catch the foundation of this journey, please go to the presentation, which is in the list. Today, I just want to share another facet of that journey. Some people have asked me, Paul, how can you believe in a God that you can't see? And I got to tell you that when we think of the world we live in, creation itself, all the things that we have an opportunity to see on a daily basis that we take for granted. But one part of living, of course, is oxygen. We have to have oxygen to breathe. But you can't see oxygen. You know it exists, but you can't see it. And for me, it goes with the same understanding. I can't see God, but I know that He exists. In this next story I want to share with you on the journey of prophetic redemption happened during the original journey of fallen prayer. Fallen Prayer, of course, is the first book that I was able to sell 5,000 copies while I was working in Michigan. And this book, 15 years later, is the entire rewrite of the first book with the ending. But the journey has been consistent throughout. And the story that I want to share with you really is my way of showing that God exists. And the way I can show that is when we look at the idea of fate or chance, those things happen, no doubt. But in the story, for it to happen the way that it did, you have to rule those out. It has to be divine intervention. It has to be so incredible that I don't need to look at this story and question my faith. All it did for me was strengthen what I already believe. Will everyone that comes to believe in Christ as the center of their lives and God, will they receive such a profound opportunity to experience what I experienced? I can't tell you. But I can promise what happened to me did happen to me. So I'm going to just go into it. During that journey, about probably 5 years into fallen prayer, I had a gentleman come in to the post office, and he said, Paul, I found your book at the secondhand store right next door. The guy there said, you know, the postmaster actually wrote this book. And he said, I'd like you to personalize it for me. So I started writing his name in the book, wrote a little something, and I handed the book back to him. I told him a little bit about the book. And he held that book up in his hand, and he said, I really need this book this weekend. And I looked into his eyes, and I could tell, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was dealing with some insecurities. And of course, I couldn't say to him, are you dealing with some insecurities? So I asked him, are you having some trust issues? And he turned around and he looked at me and he says, oh my gosh, yes. And I said, well, if you've got a second, it's lunchtime, I've got a story for you. So I proceed to tell him about this story from 5 years before, when I had a gentleman that came to the post office, old gentleman, and he would come to the post office on a tractor, lawnmower actually, and he would pick up his mail. And it got to a point where I no longer seen him, and his mail was building up. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to run the mail over to him. And come to find out, he'd gotten to a point where he was pretty much homebound. So I said, hey, listen, Joe, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring your mail to you every other day, and I'll do it at lunchtime, if that's good for you. And he's like, yeah, that'd be great. So every other day I would take his mail to him, probably a year into it. And every time I walk in the door, I'd knock on the door and I'd say, Joe, and he'd say, Paul. I'd say, here's your mail. Well, for like 6 months straight, after about a year of bringing the mail to him, he started telling me how much he hated his son, despised him. And he actually went as far as showing me a letter that his son wrote to him. And it wasn't very nice. Well, one day I was working in the post office, and I was just a regular day, and it was getting toward closing time, and I heard a voice as clear as my voice to you right now, and it said, Paul, go to Joe's house right now. And I remember distinctively looking up and saying, say what? And the voice said, go to Joe's house now. So I'm like, okay. So I grab my cash drawer, I put it in the safe, I lock it, I'm done for the day. It's 5 o'clock. And I get to the car and my heart is beating through my chest. I have no idea what I'm doing. Absolutely none. But I drive to Joe's house and I knock on the door and I say, Joe. He says, Paul, what are you doing here? And I looked at Joe and I said, Joe, do you believe that God speaks to you? And he said, he thought about it for a second and he said, well, I can't say that I've ever heard his voice, but I can tell you I felt his presence when I was in World War II in a sub. And I looked at him and I said, well, Joe, God told me to come and talk to you right now. And the smile left his face. And he looked at me as somber as can be. And he said, okay, Paul, what do you got to say? And as my heart is beating out of my chest because I have no idea what I'm even doing there, the story, what I was supposed to tell him, came to me just like that. And I looked at Joe and I said, listen, there was a time in my life where I had a friend, and he betrayed my family, almost destroyed it. And I said, I got to be honest with you, I hated this guy. I mean, I hated this guy to a point where I could have done some physical damage if I could have. That's how much I hated this person. And I said, it went on for months. And one day when I was in prayer, Joe, I was hating and despising this person. And God spoke to my heart at that time. And he said, Paul, if this person accepts my son, Jesus Christ, angels in heaven will celebrate over that conversion. So your bitterness and your hatred, they mean nothing to me. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to pray for my enemy. So instead of hating and despising this person, I started praying for him, that he would indeed find salvation. Because if he did find Jesus in his life, he wouldn't do to some other family what he did to mine. And Joe looked up and he said, I know why you're here right now. He said, you see, I haven't seen my son for years, but he's coming tomorrow. And I had every intention of telling him how much I hated him. I had every intention of cutting him out of my will. But he said, now I know what I have to do. And we said a prayer together. And he forgave his son that moment. And his son came the next day. And he signed everything over to him. Now, that was 5 years before this gentleman walked in my post office. And by then, Joe had passed away. But as I'm explaining this to this person, this guy walks into the post office at the same time I'm telling him this story. And he's got a hamburger in his hand. At first time that's ever happened. And he looks at me and he says, Paul, I was grilling this hamburger and I thought about you. It's got some mushrooms on it, some Swiss cheese. I thought you might like it. And I look at him and I take the plate with the hamburger and I walk to the back of the office and I put the plate down and he walks out the door. And I looked at John as he was sitting there with the book in his hands. And I said, you're not going to believe this. But since I told you this story about Joe, he's passed away. And the person that just came in with a hamburger, that's Joe's son. See, he ended up moving into his home. And this guy looks at me and he said, Paul, I was driving here 2.5 hours. He said 7 years ago, my wife had an affair at the cottage up here. And he said, I tried to kill myself. And he said, I knew that I had to heal to be there for my kids. But he said, all the way here for the last 2.5 hours, I've been just praying to God in my spirit, why don't you talk to me? And I looked at him and I said, John, you didn't come here to buy a book. You came here because God wanted to speak to you. And he just did. Now, this guy walks out of the post office like he's walking on 6 feet above the ground. You could just tell all of that stress, all of that hurt and pain had almost disappeared immediately. And you say to yourself, because this is really 2 stories in one. The first story is incredible. Why, when Joe's telling me about his son, all of a sudden I went over there one night because I was called to do so, and it's the day before his son comes. I didn't know that. And yet, that's what happened. Is that chance? I don't buy that. Then, as I'm telling this guy this story of forgiveness that he needed to hear, as I'm telling him this story, his son, Joe's son, walks to the door with a hamburger. Why? Out of the blue would that happen? And I didn't know John was dealing with that kind of hurt, that kind of pain. But he was. So as I'm telling this story of forgiveness, here comes another miracle that I can tell him, you're not going to believe this, but that's Joe's son. So I didn't know for 2.5 hours he was praying in his spirit that God would speak to him. Sometimes we're simply the vessel. It's always him. But we, at times, can be his voice. And again, that's a part of this journey of this book that I've been able to experience. So some people will say to me, I can't see God, so I can't believe. How can you? And I can say, like oxygen, I can't see it, but I know it exists. And when I experience what I experience, like that story, which is really 2 in 1, I don't need to see to believe. I know. Thank you.